It all started as just another call, a routine repair, nothing out of the ordinary. I didn't think much of it. Life at 60, living alone in my quiet, predictable home, had become a series of uneventful days. The spark of excitement, let's just say it had been dormant for far longer than I'd care to admit. But that Wednesday afternoon, oh, that was different. When James stepped through my door, everything shifted. He was young, confident but nervous, and there was an energy about him I couldn't ignore. It was electric, a current I hadn't felt in years. What began as a straightforward, professional interaction quickly morphed into something I couldn't define, something that scared me. The lines blurred, boundaries vanished, and I found myself teetering between need and obsession. Let me rewind. The leaking sink had been mocking me for days, a relentless drip 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 that mirrored the parts of my life I'd neglected. My once meticulously renovated home, the pride of years of effort, now felt hollow, its beauty wasted in silence. After my divorce, the house became too much. Each room echoed with memories, both sweet and bitter. The kitchen, once the heart of our family, had faded into quiet disrepair. Just like me. When the sink finally pushed me over the edge, I did something I hadn't done in years. I asked for help. Enter James. He was a local handyman, just a name I found online. I wasn't expecting much. Honestly, I thought I'd open the door to a seasoned, rugged guy in his 50s, someone who'd seen it all and fixed it all. But instead, standing there on my doorstep, was James. He was tall, maybe mid-20s, with a toolbox in one hand and a simple gray shirt stretched over broad shoulders. His smile was shy, almost hesitant, and yet there was something in his presence that made my heart skip, a small, almost forgotten thrill. "Hi, I'm here to look at the sink," he said, his voice low and calming, the kind of tone that makes you feel instantly at ease. I blinked, startled by my own reaction. At my age, I didn't think I could feel this again. This flutter of something. But there it was, unmistakable. "Come on in," I managed, stepping aside to let him pass. James moved through the kitchen with quiet focus, taking in the space before crouching to inspect the sink. His hands strong, steady, worked quickly, adjusting bolts, testing connections. I couldn't help but linger nearby, pretending to fuss with something on the counter. But really, I was watching him. There was a grace to the way he worked, a strength in his movements that drew me in. It wasn't just his looks, though, let's be honest, he was striking in that rugged, effortless way. It was his presence. He carried an energy, a vitality that clashed with the stillness of my life. For a moment, I caught myself leaning against the counter, watching him too closely, feeling, what? Intrigued, alive? Whatever it was undeniable. I adjusted my robe, something I'd never thought twice about wearing, suddenly hyper-aware of how it draped on me. I straightened up, trying to shake the ridiculous thoughts running through my mind. And then James looked up. Our eyes met, and for a fleeting second, I saw something flicker in his expression. Surprise, curiosity. I wasn't sure, but I knew one thing. Life as I knew it was about to change. He barely glanced at me before focusing back on the sink, cheeks slightly flushed. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to spark a tiny thrill within me. For the first time in what felt like years, I felt something stir, a feeling I'd carefully buried, desire. I moved closer, my footsteps soft against the kitchen floor. He was kneeling, entirely absorbed in his work, but there was something about the way his hands moved, efficient, yet slightly unsteady, that betrayed his nerves. He was trying to act unaffected, but I could see right through it. "Is everything going well down there?" I asked, my voice coming out softer than I'd intended. Without looking up, he nodded. "Yeah, I should have this fixed in just a few minutes." Unable to resist, I reached out and rested my hand lightly on his shoulder. I felt him tense under my touch, his muscles tightening instinctively. And in that moment, something flickered inside me, a surge of power, a reminder of what it felt like to have an impact on someone, It was a sensation I hadn't experienced in ages, and I wasn't ready to let it slip away just yet. "You're really strong," I said, my tone shifting ever so slightly, playful now. His head shot up, eyes wide, his cheeks burning brighter. "Ah, thank you," he stammered. I smiled, a slow, knowing smile, and felt the tension in the room grow heavier. It wasn't something we spoke of, but it hung in the air, undeniable. I watched as he shifted uncomfortably, clearly trying to stay professional, but the slight tremble in his hands as he tightened the final bolt betrayed him. I leaned casually against the counter, my eyes following his every move. He finished the job and stood, wiping his hands on a cloth. His focus was now on anything but me, as if avoiding my gaze would help him regain composure. "Do you need any help?" I asked innocently, though we both knew he didn't. "No," he muttered, shaking his head quickly. As he began packing up his tools, I reached out again, this time letting my fingers brush lightly against his arm. His skin was warm under my touch, and I felt him freeze for just a second, as if caught in some internal struggle. His eyes flicked toward mine, conflicted and anxious. It was all so clear. He wanted to give in, but he was holding himself back. He was young, and I should have known better. But in that moment, nothing else mattered. I let my palm rest on his arm, the tension between us practically crackling like electricity. He looked at me, his breathing uneven, his gaze locked on mine. For a moment, I thought he might close the distance between us, bridging the gap, but instead, he stepped back, breaking whatever spell had been cast. "Ma'am," he began, his voice shaky, "I'm just here to fix the sink." His words made me chuckle softly, amused by his nervousness. "Are you sure there's nothing else that needs your attention?" I teased, the playful edge in my tone unmistakable. His hands trembled as he gathered the last of his equipment, clearly struggling to keep his composure. I stepped closer, my lips only inches from his ear. "There's something more you could do for me," I whispered, my voice low and suggestive. He didn't respond. His eyes locked on mine, frozen in place. For a fleeting moment, I thought he might give in, that he might close the distance between us. But then, his eyes darted up to mine, and for a fleeting moment, I thought he might give in. But then, suddenly, James stepped back, his hands raised defensively, like he was building an invisible wall between us. "I can't," he said, shaking his head. I couldn't hide my disappointment and let out a soft pout. But deep down, I knew. It wasn't that he didn't feel the same. It was that he couldn't trust himself to act on it. He left quickly after that, practically sprinting out the door and leaving me standing alone in the kitchen. Yet the air he left behind was thick with something unspoken, unresolved. I knew his retreat wasn't a lack of interest. It was the opposite. He wasn't saying no because he didn't want me. He was saying no because he was afraid of how much he did. The days that followed were a strange mix of exhilaration and frustration. My thoughts kept circling back to James, his hesitation, the way his gaze lingered on me just a second too long. It had been years since anyone, or anything, had stirred something like this in me. And now, this young man had awakened feelings I thought had long since faded. I didn't expect to see him again. I figured he'd convinced himself to stay away, that returning would cross a line he wasn't willing to step over. But then, about a week later, my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but when I answered, a familiar voice greeted me. "Hi, it's James, the plumber. I was just calling to check if everything's okay with the sink. Has the fix held up?" His tone was polite, professional, but I could hear the subtle tremor underneath it. That nervous energy sent a small thrill through me. "Oh, the sink's fine," I replied casually, pretending to think it over. "But actually, I was hoping you could take a look at something else. In the bathroom. It's probably nothing, but I'd feel better if a professional inspected it." There was a pause, and I could almost hear him weighing his options on the other end. Finally, he spoke. "I can be there in about an hour." When I hung up, a small, knowing smile crept across my face. This time, I had no intention of letting him leave so easily. When James arrived, it was clear he was more tense than before. He tried to keep his professional demeanor intact, but I could see the tightness in his shoulders, the way he avoided meeting my eyes. I led him upstairs to the bathroom, where a loose faucet handle awaited him, a minor issue, easily fixed, but we both knew the faucet wasn't what brought him back. As he worked, I stood close, quietly observing. The air between us felt heavier with every passing moment, charged with an unspoken tension that made my pulse quicken. "James," I said softly, stepping closer. "I've been thinking about it." He hesitated, his hand tightening around the faucet handle. His knuckles turned white, his breathing hitched. He didn't look at me, but the tension radiating from him was impossible to ignore. "About what happened before," I continued, my voice quieter, more intimate. "You wanted to, but you held back. Why?" At first, he didn't answer. His hands kept moving, though I could see the strain in his expression. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm a professional. It wouldn't be right." I stepped closer, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him. "Who decides what's right or wrong, James? You're a grown man, and I'm a grown woman. We both know there's something here. You feel it too, don't you?" He glanced at me then, his jaw clenched, his eyes conflicted. The same turmoil as before played out on his face, a desperate effort to maintain control, to keep a boundary intact. But the line between us had already blurred, and neither of us could ignore it anymore. I let my hand brush over his chest, feeling the rapid thrum of his heartbeat beneath my fingertips. His breathing hitched, and for a moment, I thought he'd pull away. But instead, he reached out, his hand wrapping around my arm, firm but hesitant. His face was inches from mine, his breath warm against my skin. "Elizabeth," he murmured, his voice low and steady. "This isn't a game." "I never said it was," I replied, a small smile curling at my lips. His grip on my arm tightened slightly, as if he couldn't decide whether to pull me closer or push me away. The raw vulnerability in his expression was something new. Gone was the nervous politeness from before. He was unguarded now, his gaze locked on mine. The tension shifted, deepening into something far more powerful, far more dangerous. I leaned in, my lips hovering just millimeters from his, testing the line we were both too afraid to cross. He didn't move, but his breathing quickened, and I could feel the conflict within him unraveling. "Sometimes, you just have to let go," I whispered, my voice barely audible but brimming with an unmistakable promise. James froze for a heartbeat, his gaze locked on mine, as if weighing the gravity of the moment. And then, as though some unseen force overtook him, he pulled me closer and kissed me. It wasn't just a kiss, it was everything we'd been holding back, everything we tried to deny. His lips moved against mine with a desperate kind of passion that sent shivers through me. His hands gripped my waist, firm but trembling, like he couldn't bear the thought of letting go. When we finally pulled apart, gasping for breath, our foreheads rested together. The sound of our breathing filled the silence, uneven and raw. His heartbeat pounded against his chest, mirroring the wild rhythm of my own. His eyes met mine, filled with a vulnerability that cut straight through me. "What happens now?" he asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I smiled, stepping back just enough to give him space. Even then, the pull between us felt magnetic, undeniable. "I think you already know the answer to that, James," I murmured, my voice calm yet certain in a way I hadn't felt in years. "We've crossed the line. There's no going back now." For a moment, he just stood there, silent, the conflict playing out across his face. His eyes flicked toward the door, as though contemplating an escape. But then, with one last glance, he reached for me again, his hands finding my waist and pulling me closer. This time, there was no hesitation, no second guessing. The rest of the afternoon unfolded in a blur. We barely made it out of the bathroom before years of pent-up tension finally unraveled. His hands were everywhere, on my shoulders, my waist, my hips. His touch was commanding yet gentle, a strange balance of control and surrender. I hadn't felt this alive in years. Not since before the divorce. My life had become an endless loop of quiet dinners alone, nights spent in front of the TV, and sporadic phone calls from my kids. I hadn't realized how much I'd been craving this connection, desire, the feeling of being seen. James kissed me deeply, his lips trailing down my neck, his hands sliding to my hips. A soft cry escaped me, my head tipping back as I let myself give in completely. There was something intoxicating about this moment, about him, this young, strong man who made me feel like someone worth wanting again. It wasn't just physical, it was something deeper, a connection neither of us had anticipated but couldn't ignore. We eventually stumbled into the bedroom, the air around us crackling with an energy I hadn't felt in years. As we lay tangled in the sheets, I couldn't help but smile to myself. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt alive. I've never done anything like this before, James admitted, his voice low and rough as he traced lazy circles on my arm with his fingertips. Neither have I replied, just as softly. He turned to face me, his expression unexpectedly vulnerable. I shouldn't have, he said, shaking his head, but then added, but I don't regret it. I placed my hand on his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath my fingers. A small, knowing smile spread across my lips. We lay there for a while, the silence between us comfortable, yet heavy with the weight of what had just happened. It wasn't awkward, though. It felt like we'd crossed a threshold we hadn't known existed, and there was no turning back. Eventually, James sat up and glanced at the clock. I should go, he said reluctantly, his tone mirroring the hesitation in his movements. You don't have to, I replied softly, even though I knew he would. He hesitated, his gaze lingering on me, as though he wanted to stay. But then he shook his head. I don't want things to get complicated. I understood what he meant. With a small grin, I sat up beside him. James, I said, my voice steady, you're a good man. We both needed this, and I'm glad it happened. But I never expected anything more. He smiled back, a mix of relief and gratitude in his expression. And as he left, I realized something. For the first time in years, I felt free. His expression softened, but a flicker of confusion lingered in his eyes, as if he wasn't used to something so simple. So, everything's fine. Nothing weird or unexpected, he asked, his voice tinged with hesitation. I couldn't help but chuckle, shaking my head. No, James. No strange sensations, no drama. It was just a moment. No strings, no pressure. He nodded, but it was slow, almost like he was still trying to process the simplicity of it all. Okay, he said after a long pause. I guess I'll see you around. Maybe, I teased, a playful smile tugging at my lips. If my sink breaks again, you'll be the first person I call. That got a smile out of him. He grabbed his tools, slung his bag over his shoulder, and headed for the door. But just before leaving, he turned back, his voice soft but full of sincerity. Elizabeth, he said, holding my gaze, I don't regret it. I just want you to know that. As the door closed behind him, I whispered after him, I don't regret it either. In the days that followed, I thought about James more than I should have. Every time I walked past the sink, I'd remember the way his hands trembled, the warmth of his kiss, the hesitant yet undeniable passion in the way he had finally let go. I hadn't expected him to call. Honestly, I figured he convinced himself it was a one-time thing, something that shouldn't have happened in the first place. And maybe he was right. Maybe it shouldn't have. But regret? That was the one thing I didn't feel. Even as I told myself I'd likely never see him again, a small, restless part of me hoped I would. I knew that if he called, I wouldn't say no. And then, one afternoon, my phone rang. When I saw his name flash on the screen, my heart skipped a beat. I wasn't expecting it. I hadn't even dared to hope for it. But there it was. His name, his number, and the possibility of everything we'd shared rushing back to life. Hey, he said, his voice tentative, cautious, like he wasn't sure if he should be calling at all. I wanted to check on the faucet. Make sure everything's still working fine. There was a pause. I could hear the uncertainty in his voice, like he was trying to convince himself this was just a professional call. But we both knew better. The faucet's fine, I replied, my voice dropping just enough to let him know I wasn't really talking about the sink. But there's another issue you might be able to help me with. Another pause. I could practically hear him weighing his options on the other end of the line, debating whether he should come back. I'll be there in an hour, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. When I hung up, a wave of anticipation swept over me. It had been so long since I'd felt this kind of excitement, a mix of nerves and raw, undeniable desire coursing through me like electricity. I told myself it was just a fleeting indulgence, nothing serious. But deep down, I already knew it was becoming so much more. That hour crawled by. I busied myself with meaningless tasks, organizing drawers, rearranging shelves, anything to distract from the anticipation building inside me. And then he was there, standing in the doorway, hesitant but drawn by the same pull I felt. His eyes met mine, and that flicker of uncertainty was still there. But beneath it, something darker, something deeper smoldered. I led him to the bathroom, pretending there was a minor issue with the faucet. He followed, and the air between us grew heavier with every step. James tried to focus on the task, his hands fiddling with the faucet, his eyes fixed on his work. But I saw the tension in his shoulders, the slight tremble in his fingers. He was nervous. So was I. I stepped closer, watching him pretend to inspect the faucet, the silence between us thick with unspoken desire. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I reached out, resting my hand lightly on his shoulder. His body went rigid beneath my touch, and for a moment, he didn't move, didn't even breathe. Slowly, he turned to face me, his eyes filled with the same conflict as before, locked on mine. "You don't have to pretend," I whispered, my voice soft but insistent. His breath hitched. For a second, I thought he might pull away again, like the last time. But then, something shifted. His resolve broke. His defenses crumbled. Without another word, he pulled me into his arms, his lips crashing against mine. The force of it left me breathless. This time was different. This time, there was no hesitation, no second guessing. James wasn't holding back anymore. His hands moved over me with a sense of urgency that sent shivers down my spine, a touch that was equal parts need and passion. I kissed him back, my fingers tangling in his hair, as I pressed myself closer, completely swept up in the moment. Neither of us stopped. There was no pause, no break. The bathroom felt too small, too confining for the energy between us. Without breaking the kiss, James scooped me up and carried me to the bedroom. That's where everything else, boundaries, reservations, reality, melted away. The hours that followed were a blur of emotion and sensation. The world outside ceased to exist as we gave in to the desire we'd both fought to ignore. James's touch was a mixture of tenderness and urgency, and every moment felt like it was burning into my memory. For the first time in years, I felt truly alive. The weight of routine of years spent wrapped in the quiet loneliness of a big, empty house disappeared. With James, I wasn't just existing. I was seen, wanted, desired. His hands, his lips, they moved with both control and release, a balance that left me breathless. I matched his passion, holding on to him as if letting go would shatter the fragile beauty of what we were sharing. And when it was over, as we lay tangled together in the aftermath, the silence between us wasn't awkward. It was comforting. James's slow, steady breath brushed against my neck as his fingers absent-mindedly traced patterns on my skin. I closed my eyes, savoring the warmth of his body next to mine, the weight of his presence. For a long while, neither of us spoke. Words weren't necessary. What had just happened wasn't fleeting or shallow. It was deeper, more profound than either of us had anticipated. But reality has a way of creeping back in, no matter how much you try to hold it at bay. As the hours passed, I began to feel the weight of it all pressing down on me. James was so much younger, and though age hadn't mattered in the heat of the moment, I couldn't ignore it forever. I glanced at him lying beside me, his eyes closed, his breathing peaceful. He looked content, but a pang of doubt rippled through me. How long would that contentment last? How long before the complications of what we were doing caught up with him, caught up with us? I sat up slowly, careful not to wake him, and wrapped the blanket around me. The last rays of sunlight spilled through the window, casting a soft golden glow across the room. The rational part of me knew this couldn't last. What we had was temporary, a fleeting moment we'd stumbled into. But there was another part of me, a part I'd buried for years, that wanted it to last, that wanted him to stay, and that terrified me. The days that followed were filled with a strange mix of longing and uncertainty. James and I continued to see each other, but something had shifted. He was still kind, still attentive, but there was a distance now. An unspoken tension lingered between us, and neither of us dared to address it. I saw it in his eyes, the conflict, the hesitation every time we were together. James was wrestling with something, and deep down, I knew what it was. The age gap between us, once an exhilarating taboo, now loomed over us like a shadow. I noticed the way people looked at us when we were out together. The curious glances, the judgmental stares. It didn't matter that James made me feel younger, alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. To the outside world, we didn't make sense. And slowly, I began to feel the weight of their judgment too. One evening, as we sat on the couch, James reached for my hand. His touch was gentle, but the look in his eyes made my heart sink. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice hesitant, unsure, "about us." A lump formed in my throat, but I nodded, urging him to go on. "This is complicated, Elizabeth," he said softly, his tone firm but laced with regret. "I don't regret anything, but I don't know how to make this work." I'd been dreading this moment, but I knew it was coming. I tried to keep my voice steady as I replied, "You don't have to explain. I know this is difficult." James looked at me, and there was a sadness in his eyes I hadn't expected. "I don't want to hurt you," he said, "but I can't keep pretending that this is normal." His words hit me hard, but I forced myself to stay composed. I had known all along that what we had wouldn't last, but hearing him say it made the inevitable unraveling feel so much more real. Even though we continued to see each other for a while after that conversation, something fundamental had shifted. The simple intimacy we'd shared was gone, replaced by a growing awkwardness we couldn't escape. I could feel James pulling away, bit by bit, despite his efforts to hold on. And though I didn't want to admit it, I was scared. Scared of losing him, scared of returning to the quiet loneliness that had defined my life before him. But most of all, scared of how much I'd let myself care. I sat alone in the living room, staring at my phone, waiting it to ring. James had promised to come by that afternoon, but the hours dragged on, and there was no sign of him. Anxiety crept in, knotting itself tightly in my chest. I could feel it. He was pulling away, and the worst part, I didn't know how to stop it. Finally, my phone buzzed. My heart leaped, but when I saw his name, it sank just as quickly. The message was short, painfully simple. Asterisk, "I'm sorry. I can't make it tonight. I need some time to think." Asterisk. I stared at the screen, the words hitting me harder than I expected. I'd known this was coming, but seeing it laid out like that, black and white, undeniable, made it all too real. I didn't respond. What could I even say? Instead, I sat there in the dark, the silence of the house pressing in on me. The thrill, the warmth, the connection that had once filled me had been replaced by an emptiness I couldn't shake, a weight I didn't know how to escape. I had told myself this was just a temporary escape, something to reignite a spark in a life that had grown quiet and predictable. But the truth was, I had fallen for him, and now, I was dealing with the consequences. A week passed, and James didn't call. I threw myself into meaningless tasks, organizing drawers, cleaning corners of the house no one ever saw, trying to outrun the ache that followed me everywhere. But deep down, I knew. I could feel it slipping away, and no amount of busywork could change that. Then, one evening, As the sun dipped below the horizon, my phone rang. His name lit up the screen, and my heart pounded. I wasn't expecting it, but there it was, a chance, maybe the last one. "Can I come over?" he asked, his voice quiet, hesitant. "Of course," I said, though I already knew what this was. When he arrived, the tension was immediate. James looked tired, as though he hadn't slept in days. Every line on his face told me he'd been wrestling with something heavy. We sat down in the living room, the silence between us thick with everything we weren't saying. I waited, letting him find the words, though each second felt like an eternity. "Elizabeth," he finally began, his voice soft, "I've been doing a lot of thinking." My heart pounded in my chest, but I nodded, urging him to go on. "I care about you," he said, his eyes locking onto mine, raw and sincere. "More than I ever thought I would. But I can't keep doing this. I can't pretend the age difference doesn't matter, or that this isn't complicated." Tears threatened to spill, but I swallowed them down. I had known this was coming. It didn't make it hurt any less. "I understand," I whispered, my voice barely audible. James reached for my hand, his touch warm but hesitant, as if trying to comfort me while breaking my heart at the same time. "I don't want to hurt you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I think it's best if we end this now, before it gets even harder." I nodded, unable to speak. My throat felt tight, and the lump there refused to budge. For a moment, we just sat there, his hand wrapped around mine, both of us holding on to the last remnants of something we knew we had to let go of. Finally, James stood, his movements slow, deliberate. He glanced around the room, as though committing it to memory, then turned back to me. "Take care of yourself, Elizabeth," he said, his voice soft but final. "You too, James," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady, though the weight of everything unsaid pressed heavily on me. He lingered for a moment, as if unsure whether to stay or go. But then, with one last look, he turned and walked to the door. I watched him leave, the door clicking shut behind him. The sound echoed in the silence, marking the end of something I wasn't ready to let go of. The house felt impossibly quiet after he left, the emptiness wrapping around me like a heavy fog. I sat there for a long time, staring at the door, trying to make sense of everything. The thrill, the connection, the passion, it had all been so real, so vivid. And now, it was gone. Eventually, I stood, my body heavy with exhaustion, and made my way to the bedroom. The bed felt too big, too empty without him beside me. As I lay there in the dark, my mind replayed every moment. Had I let myself fall too hard? Had I made a mistake? But even as the sadness washed over me, I knew one thing for certain. I wouldn't change a thing. What I had shared with James had awakened something in me, something I thought I'd lost forever. I was alive, still capable of feeling, of experiencing. Weeks turned into months, and slowly, the ache of missing James began to soften. It didn't disappear completely. There were still moments when his memory crept in, moments when I felt that familiar tug of longing. But those moments grew fewer, and the emptiness he left behind began to fill with something else: acceptance. Looking back, I could see it clearly. What James and I had wasn't meant to last. It was a brief, intense connection, a spark that reignited something in me I thought was gone forever. It had pulled me out of the monotony of my life, jolting me awake, reminding me of what it felt like to truly live. And while it ended, it left its mark. It changed me. The quiet loneliness that once weighed down my home no longer felt as oppressive. I reclaimed my space, made it mine again. I reached out to old friends, reconnecting with people I hadn't spoken to in years. I joined a local book club, something I'd always wanted to do but kept putting off. And then there was painting. I spent afternoons letting color spill across canvas, rediscovering a kind of peace I hadn't felt in what seemed like a lifetime. Through it all, I kept James tucked away in a quiet corner of my heart. I didn't dwell on him, but I didn't push the memories away either. He was part of my story now, a chapter that shaped who I was becoming. One evening, months after James left, I found myself sitting on the back porch, a glass of wine in hand. The sun sank low, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, while the crisp autumn air hinted at the change of seasons. As I sat there, something dawned on me. I was content, not just with the quiet, solitary life I had rebuilt, but with the knowledge that I had lived, that I had opened myself up to something real, even if it was fleeting. James came into my life unexpectedly, and just as suddenly, he was gone. But what he left behind, that stayed. He reminded me that life doesn't have to follow a script, that some of the most profound moments come from the most unexpected places. I took a sip of my wine, a small smile tugging at my lips as I thought about the future. It was uncertain, sure. I didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in a long time, that uncertainty didn't scare me, because I had rediscovered a part of myself I thought was lost forever. And that was enough. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared below the horizon, I stood up and walked back into the house. It no longer felt cold or empty. It felt warm, welcoming mine. I closed the door behind me, and with it, a chapter of my life. But instead of sadness, I felt something new. Hope, because I'd already faced the hardest part, letting go.